The box within the prison. Hit subscribe because the story you're about to hear isn't just about prison walls and steel doors. It's about what happens when punishment turns into torture, and the human mind begins to break. The birth of a monster prison. The Northern California coastline is beautiful in a way that feels almost cruel. Dense redwood forests stretch toward a mist-covered horizon. The Pacific pounds against jagged rocks, sending spray high into the air. Tourists drive through Crescent City in the summer months, snapping photos of the towering trees and the shimmering coastline. Few stop long enough to notice the colossal structure looming in the distance, tucked behind layers of barbed wire, watchtowers, and concrete. That fortress is Pelican Bay State Prison, and within its walls lies the infamous Security Housing Unit, better known simply as the SHU. When Pelican Bay opened in 1989, the SHU was presented to the public as a necessity, a place to control the worst of the worst. Gang leaders, violent lifers, prison instigators, the men who supposedly couldn't exist in a normal correctional environment. The concept wasn't new, but Pelican Bay perfected it. Here, solitary confinement was no longer a disciplinary tool for misbehavior, it became a permanent sentence within a sentence. Prisoners could be consigned to the SHU indefinitely, not for what they did but for who prison officials believed they were connected to. Sometimes, the evidence was nothing more than tattoos, drawings, or even the possession of a certain book. This system would go on for decades, and it would destroy thousands of lives. Inside the box. Step inside the SHU and you enter a different world. One deliberately designed to erase humanity. Each cell measures about 8 feet by 10 feet. A concrete slab doubles as a bed. A toilet and sink are molded into the wall. The door is solid steel with a narrow slot for food trays and handcuffs. There are no bars. No windows that face the outside. Only a small, perforated slot near the ceiling lets in filtered air and faint light. Prisoners are confined 22 to 24 hours a day. When they are allowed yard time, it's not in a green field under the sun but in a concrete pen the size of a dog kennel, open only to the sky. Contact with other people is nearly non-existent. No classes. No group recreation. No jobs. Visits take place behind thick glass. Conversations with neighbors require shouting through air vents. One prisoner once described it as being buried alive in concrete. The logic of control. Why would California build such a place? The official answer, gangs. By the late 1980s, prison gangs in California had evolved into sprawling criminal networks. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla family wielded enormous influence behind bars and on the streets. Officials believed the only way to dismantle these organizations was to cut off their leadership. So gang shot callers were identified and locked away in the SHU indefinitely. The policy was simple. If you were accused of gang affiliation, you went to the SHU. Getting out required debriefing, in other words, snitching. You had to give up names, networks, and details about gang operations. If you refused, you stayed in the box. For many, that meant years, sometimes decades, without touching another human being. The toll on the mind. Psychologists began warning early on that prolonged solitary confinement would have catastrophic effects. Prisoners reported hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing figures in the dark. Anxiety spiraled into panic attacks. Some paced their cells endlessly, unable to stop. Others sank into deep depression, refusing food, staring at walls for hours at a time. In the 1990s, one court case brought this suffering to light. Madrid versus Gomez, 1995. The lawsuit alleged systemic abuse and unconstitutional conditions at Pelican Bay's SHU. Federal Judge Thelton Henderson delivered a searing judgment, noting that solitary confinement could push mentally ill inmates into psychosis. He wrote, "The SHU may press the outer borders of what most humans can psychologically tolerate. But while the court acknowledged the psychological torment, it stopped short of declaring indefinite solitary unconstitutional. The system remained intact." Stories from the SHU. Behind the statistics were human beings, men whose lives unraveled inside the concrete box. Todd Ashker, one of the most well-known SHU prisoners, spent more than 20 years in isolation. Convicted of murder, he became a plaintiff in multiple lawsuits against the prison. Ashker described losing his ability to concentrate, his eyesight weakening from lack of natural light, and his body deteriorating from lack of movement. Hugo Pinnell, a former Black Panther, spent decades in solitary, widely regarded as one of the longest-held isolation prisoners in California. To his supporters, Pinnell was a political prisoner targeted for his activism. To prison officials, he was too dangerous to release. He would spend over 40 years in solitary confinement, becoming a symbol of resistance and of cruelty. Other men described even darker turns. Some mutilated themselves. Some attempted suicide. A few succeeded. One chilling account described a prisoner who had spent 15 years in the SHU. He told visiting researchers, "I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself. Every year, another piece disappears. Silence outside, pressure inside." For years, the public barely knew this world existed. Prisoners in solitary confinement were invisible. Letters were censored, visits rare, and officials carefully controlled media access. But inside the prison walls, tension grew. By the 2000s, entire prison yards were being controlled from the SHU. Ironically, the very system designed to cripple gang leadership allowed them to operate with even greater secrecy. Orders were passed through coded letters, legal visits, and fishing lines, ropes made of sheets that slid messages between cells. Officials insisted the SHU was working. But critics saw something else, a warehouse for men who had been forgotten by society. The breaking point. In 2011, the silence broke. A group of SHU prisoners, including Ashker, organized a hunger strike. Their demands were basic: an end to indefinite solitary confinement, more humane conditions, warm clothing, phone calls, better food, a fairer system for reviewing alleged gang affiliation. The strike quickly spread beyond Pelican Bay. At its peak, thousands of inmates across California refused meals. Families, activists, and journalists began shining a spotlight on Pelican Bay like never before. Prison officials downplayed the protest, insisting conditions were necessary for safety. But photos of emaciated prisoners and stories of decades in solitary shocked the public. The stage was set for a battle that would drag California into the center of a human rights firestorm. By the end of 2011, the hunger strike had ended, but the momentum had begun. Lawsuits mounted. Media attention grew. International human rights groups began calling Pelican Bay's SHU a form of torture. And inside those cells, men who had been buried for decades began to realize they had one final weapon: their voices. But the prison administration had its own plan. And as the conflict escalated, the fight for the future of the SHU would grow more dangerous than ever. The spark of rebellion. By 2011, Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, had already buried men alive in silence for decades. The first hunger strike in July of that year cracked open the door. But the prison system, hardened and bureaucratic, thought it could wait them out. The Department of Corrections made promises. They spoke of reforms. They hinted at new policies. And then, nothing. Conditions stayed the same. Cells stayed locked. Men stayed in the box. For the prisoners, it was clear: change wouldn't come from polite requests. It would only come if they forced the outside world to pay attention. That realization set the stage for 2013, the largest prison hunger strike in California history. The architects of resistance. At the center of the movement were four men, all buried in the SHU at Pelican Bay for decades. Todd Ashker, a convicted murderer who transformed into a legal strategist, filing lawsuits against the system. Sitawa Nantambu Jama, Ronnie Dewberry, connected to the black guerrilla family who became a voice for racial unity and protest. Antonio Guillen, tied to Nuestra Familia, he bridged rival groups in a rare alliance. Arturo Castellanos, a reputed shot caller for the Mexican Mafia, who stunned many by signing onto a movement that cut across gang lines. These four men who had once been separated by blood feuds and gang wars, crafted a historic alliance. In secret meetings through air vents, letters, and kites, notes passed hand to hand, they drafted a set of 5 core demands: end group punishment and administrative abuse, abolish the debriefing policy and indefinite SHU terms, expand programs and privileges for SHU inmates, provide adequate food, create and institute constructive parole programs. It wasn't just about personal comfort, it was about survival. And it was about ending what they, and now human rights experts, called state-sponsored psychological torture. Day 1, July 8, 2013. The strike began quietly. Prisoners across Pelican Bay pushed away their food trays. The clatter of untouched metal echoed through the block. Guards smirked, confident it wouldn't last. But it spread. By the second day, reports showed 30,000 inmates statewide had joined in solidarity, refusing meals in Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Folsom, San Quentin, and beyond. The scale was unprecedented. California's entire prison system was convulsing under coordinated, peaceful resistance. The outside world takes notice. Unlike in 2011, This time the prisoners weren't alone. Families organized rallies outside the prison gates. Activists marched through downtown Oakland, Sacramento, and Los Angeles carrying banners, "Solitary is torture." The media picked up the story. The New Yorker published haunting descriptions of men who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years without human contact. International bodies like Amnesty International and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture condemned California. For the first time, the suffering inside the SHU was no longer invisible. It was on the front page. Inside the hunger strike. The days stretched on. By the second week, prisoners were visibly wasting away. Lips cracked. Voices grew weak. Some collapsed during head counts. Medical staff hovered nervously. The prison system called it manipulation. Officials argued the SHU was essential to stop gangs. But the image of thousands of starving prisoners, men reduced to skeletons in their cells, was too powerful to dismiss. Letters smuggled out painted a desperate picture. One read, "We are being forced to choose between our lives and our dignity. If we must die in here, let the world know why." The state pushes back. California's Department of Corrections didn't bend easily. They downplayed numbers. They claimed many prisoners were secretly eating. They insisted the SHU wasn't torture, just necessary security. Governor Jerry Brown largely stayed silent. His administration hoped the protest would fizzle. But it didn't. By day 30, the hunger strike was the longest and largest in U.S. prison history. Medical reports showed dozens of men on the brink of organ failure. At least one prisoner was placed in critical condition. The situation was unsustainable. Breaking point. In August, lawmakers finally intervened. California state senators announced public hearings on solitary confinement. Families testified. Experts described the psychological devastation. Prison officials were grilled on why men could be kept in isolation for decades without due process. The spotlight worked. On September 5, 2013, after 60 days without food, the strike officially ended. Leaders declared victory, not because all demands were met, but because they had forced the state to the negotiating table. The aftermath of the strike. The hunger strike didn't topple the SHU overnight, but it cracked the foundation. California agreed to review its policies. Inmates were promised more humane conditions, warmer clothing, calendars, photographs, even the chance for group recreation in small cages. Most importantly, the practice of indefinite solitary confinement was now under national scrutiny. For Ashker, Jama, Guillen, and Castellanos, the strike had proven something extraordinary. Men the state had branded as irredeemable could unite across racial and gang lines to fight for human dignity. The story wasn't over though. California's promises were vague. Change was slow. And many suspected the state was buying time, hoping public attention would fade. But the prisoners weren't finished. They had one more weapon to use, the courts. In 2014, a federal class action lawsuit known as Ashker versus Governor of California began moving forward. At its heart was a simple question. Was indefinite solitary confinement cruel and unusual punishment? For the men of Pelican Bay's SHU, it was their last chance to force the state's hand. And for the system that had buried them for decades, it was a fight they could no longer ignore. The fall of the SHU. Subscribe now because what comes next is the story of how the most feared prison unit in America finally cracked under the weight of its own secrets. The lawsuit that shook California. By 2014, the hunger strikes had exposed Pelican Bay's SHU to the world. But inside those concrete walls, little had changed. Men still sat in isolation year after year, decade after decade. That's when a group of prisoners, led by Todd Ashker and backed by the Center for Constitutional Rights, decided to take the fight into the courts. The case, filed as Ashker versus Governor of California, argued that indefinite solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment, the constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment. For years, California had defended the SHU as a necessary tool to stop gang violence. But in federal court, the stories of men broken by years in the box painted a different picture. Testimony from the tomb. The lawsuit brought out testimony that chilled even seasoned lawyers. Prisoners described hallucinating voices after years in silence. Others said they'd lost the ability to hold conversations, their minds unraveling from lack of human contact. One man said he had been locked in the SHU for over 25 years, never once seeing the ocean that roared just beyond the prison walls. Medical experts testified that prolonged isolation caused measurable brain damage, shrinkage in regions tied to memory and decision-making. Psychologists compared it to placing a person in a sensory deprivation experiment, but one that lasted not hours but decades. The evidence was overwhelming. What California called security, human rights experts called torture. The state's last defense. California's lawyers fought back. They argued that the SHU wasn't punishment, it was protection. They claimed prisoners sent to the unit were dangerous gang leaders, men who ordered murders and drug deals from their cells. Removing them from the general population, the state insisted, saved lives. But under cross-examination, cracks showed. Officials admitted that prisoners could be placed in the SHU for association, not proven violence. A drawing. Even possession of a certain book could be labeled evidence of gang affiliation. Most damning of all, they admitted there was no end date. Unless an inmate debriefed and informed on others, risking retaliation, he could stay in the SHU for life. The courtroom gasped as one document revealed that more than 500 men had been held in Pelican Bay's SHU for over 10 years. Dozens had been isolated for 20 years or more. The settlement of 2015. The state knew it was cornered. In 2015, California agreed to a groundbreaking settlement. The terms were historic. Indefinite solitary confinement was abolished. The SHU would no longer be used simply for alleged gang affiliation. Inmates would have a step-down program, allowing gradual reintegration into the general population. Hundreds of men who had been buried in the SHU for decades were suddenly transferred back into mainline prisons. For the prisoners who had organized, starved, and sued, it was a victory that once seemed impossible. Todd Ashker and the others, still locked inside Pelican Bay, learned of the settlement through their lawyers. For some, the moment was surreal. After 20 or 30 years in a box, they were finally going to step back into a world with human contact. Freedom of a sort. But freedom inside prison is complicated. Men who had spent decades in solitary now faced crowded yards, noisy dorms, and constant interaction. Some felt liberated. Others felt overwhelmed, their senses overloaded after years of silence. One man said the noise of the chow hall felt like an explosion in his head. Another described standing in the sun for the first time in 25 years. He wept uncontrollably, not out of joy but because it hurt to feel something so bright. Not everyone made it. Some men, after years of psychological damage, couldn't adapt. They lashed out, self-harmed, or begged to go back into isolation. The SHU had ended as a system, but its scars were permanent. The legacy of the SHU. The fall of Pelican Bay's SHU reverberated across America. Other states began facing lawsuits. The federal government issued new guidelines warning against prolonged isolation. Internationally, California was shamed into recognizing solitary confinement as a human rights issue. But even as reforms spread, critics argued it wasn't enough. Solitary confinement still exists in U.S. prisons, sometimes under new names, sometimes with new rules. Inmates can still spend months or years in isolation, though the days of indefinite, decades-long terms are largely over. Pelican Bay's SHU became a symbol of the darkest extremes of the prison system, and of the power of resistance, even from the most unlikely men. The haunted walls. Today, Pelican Bay's SHU still stands. The corridors are silent, the cells mostly empty. But former guards say the place feels cursed, as if the walls themselves absorbed the screams of the men who once lived there. Visitors describe the sensation of walking through a graveyard, not of bodies but of minds. In Crescent City, locals drive past the prison on Highway 101. Some glance at the towers. Most look away. Few realize that just beyond those trees once stood one of the most notorious solitary confinement units in the world. In 2016, a journalist interviewed one of the hunger strike leaders. He asked what victory felt like after all those years. The man paused, staring at the floor. "Victory," he said. "You don't call it victory when you lose half your life in a box. What we won was the right to be human again. And that should never have been something we had to fight for." The SHU at Pelican Bay is gone, but its shadow lingers. It raises a question the justice system still struggles to answer. At what point does punishment become torture? Because the men who walked out of the SHU didn't walk out free. They walked out haunted. And if you think this story ended here, you're wrong. Across the US, men and women are still locked in boxes, still waiting, still breaking. If you thought Pelican Bay was the end of solitary, wait until you see what's happening in the prisons they don't talk about. Hit subscribe because the next story takes us even deeper into the darkness.